Hello, 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 and welcome. This is her talk show. My name is Sabrina Victoria, and I am here with Ava. We are going to be talking all about pleasure as your secret to peak performance. I'm super, super excited for this topic. So get comfortable as we explore all the triumphs, all the challenges faced by women worldwide. We're going to be offering some insights, some inspiration to fuel not only your personal, but also your professional growth. So let's jump in.
Get ready, because today's guest is about to change the way you view your world. This is Her Talk Show, hosted by Sabrina Victoria.
If you're listening live, welcome. And if you're listening on the replay, make sure you hashtag replay wherever you're at so we can send you some love in the comments. We're here every day. We delve deep into the realms of health, wealth, and leadership with some of the most brilliant women globally. We've interviewed over 600 women, and today we are adding another one to the list. We have Ava. She's an intimacy coach and founder of Diamond Ascension, a service-based mission to heal the planet one female O at a time. She helps busy women from all backgrounds to embrace pleasure and design the sex and intimacy they crave as fuel for their wildest ambitions. Welcome, lady.
Thank you. Thank you.
So excited to have you and so excited for this topic. I think this is a topic that we need to be talking more about.
Absolutely.
Do you find that?
Yeah, oftentimes when I'm speaking to women and they ask what I do, they're like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. So yeah, there's still, even in a world where we're expanding on our understanding of sexuality and intimacy, a lot of women don't know that this work is actually readily available, and it gets to amplify and affect like all areas of their lives.
Yeah. Speaking of like my generation, I'm 42. I think all of our sex talk or just any information regarding that came out of like 17 magazine and Glamour.
Yeah.
Like I think that's predominantly where I got my like sex ed.
Exactly. Right. And even today as adult women, it's like some of us are thinking like, oh, this is what's available. And it kind of skews our idea of like what sex actually is and what that gets to be for each of us.
Yeah. And I think the main thing is too, that's kind of coming up for me here is how reading into like, let's just say a magazine where all the things are like plastered on just like one page, right? And how cookie cutter that is versus realizing, when we realize that there's individuals like you out there, that it's not cookie cutter.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, sex and intimacy goes far beyond just tips and tricks that you find in a magazine, or it even extends beyond sexual education itself. So it's a big part of the work that I'm doing is helping us to like expand our understanding of what sex and pleasure can actually do for us and our healing and our evolution as human beings and our success and our relationships and far beyond that.
Yeah. I know you talk a lot about how incorporating pleasure can help us every day. What does that mean?
So pleasure, I like to say you can use pleasure as medicine. And there's several different reasons that pleasure is the antidote to a lot of the suffering that we experience, especially as women. So one of those things is that pleasure helps us to regulate, as we know, especially like business owners or just living our lives, we can become extremely dysregulated. And so pleasure is a way for us to come back into balance and harmony in the nervous system. Pleasure can also be used to remove trauma from the body, especially sexual pleasure when done with intention. And then pleasure also helps to rewire the subconscious mind into that state of safety in the body.
Can we just be clear on what pleasure means?
I believe that pleasure brings a feeling of joy and fulfillment, and pleasure looks different for every single woman. I think that pleasure can come in many different forms, and I like to categorize those as 4 different forms of pleasure. So We have sexual pleasure, we have spiritual pleasure, we have emotional pleasure, and then we have sensual pleasure. So when we start to look at pleasure in these different, I guess, categories, it helps us to look where we're actually prioritizing pleasure in one area than the other, or we only have pleasure in the bedroom, but then emotional, spiritual, and sensual pleasure is just non-existent. So that's something that I really love to look at, especially when we're in the beginning stages of understanding what pleasure is and what that experience can do for us.
What would be the difference between sensual pleasure and sexual pleasure?
I love that question. So, sexual pleasure obviously is the act of having sex. It's sexual satisfaction, arousal, learning how to have different forms of orgasm, playing with different tools and toys, and just exploring our sexuality in general. And sensual pleasure can be, right, we're tapping into the senses. And so sometimes, right, the sexual and sensual pleasures are going to overlap and be interconnected, but sometimes they're not. So sensual pleasure can be like walking on bare grass and like really tuning into the feeling of that beneath your feet. It can be taking time in the shower to feel the water on your skin. I really like to tune into the elements when it comes to sensual pleasure, but it could also be getting a massage, different like body work, right? Healing through the body. And so sensual pleasures are anything that has to do with the senses.
So are these four things needs or are these wants?
Pleasure is always a need. Pleasure is a requirement for our evolution as women, as well as for living a life that is fully integrated. So if we don't have pleasure and we don't prioritize pleasure, we always will feel that something is missing, right? And this is like such contradictory to a lot of what we see out there, especially in spiritual teachings. It's very much like you are not your body, and it's disconnecting us from this direct line of communication that we have between our pleasure and the rest of our lives. So pleasure is always a requirement for us to be a fully integrated human being and to become a mature human being. And that includes sex too.
Are these requirements for men and women or just women?
Absolutely. Yeah, men and women. And for men, it's, a big part of this is forming a healthy relationship to sex and pleasure, the same way that women need to also form healthy relationships to sex and pleasure. Sometimes we access those in different ways.
I like that. You mentioned something really fast that I kind of want to just touch on because I don't know what it means. You said you were talking about spiritual pleasure, and you said sometimes you're taught that you're not your body. What does that mean to you?
So spiritual pleasure is anything that connects us to something. I don't want to use the term greater than ourselves, but there's an expansion that happens. And oftentimes, whether we're religious or not, and we're trying to connect to something that feels like this expansion within us, right? As a spiritual pleasure can help us to evolve our understanding of our tendencies, our human tendencies, like different emotions that we experience, our relationship to our identity, right? So spiritual pleasure is a way for us to connect deeply to ourselves and to other people. And so that leads me to this idea, I guess, or perspective that pleasure also isn't just for us. Pleasure is for us to evolve our relationships, and that ripples out and it affects everyone we come in contact with. This is stuff that affects generations, right? Because we're healing on this level as women in a society that has told us that pleasure is not important, that we need to that we can't be safe in the body to express our needs, desires, and make pleasure something that is foundational to our evolution, right? So spiritual pleasure fits into all of those different different ideas that I just mentioned, right? It's not just for us. It's this beautiful ripple effect that gets to affect everyone that we come in contact with, as well as future generations.
Yeah. I really appreciate this. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I got pregnant at the age of 20. I wasn't married. So I was what's called disfellowshipped, which means I got banned from every person I had ever known my whole life.
Yeah.
And I know I'm not the only one that feels this way. There's people who are no longer Jehovah's Witnesses and people who are Jehovah's Witnesses that, and all religion, like what you're kind of saying, not all, a lot of religion. They do. There's this blanket over pleasure.
Right.
Just in general. And it makes it dirty and gross and sinful.
Yeah.
And I remember stepping into more of a sexual mindset in my late 30s. And I'm sure there's a lot of women that do that right around that time. And even just the way I approached it in a very like tippy toe way of like, what does this say about me now?
Yeah. So like I've worked with so many men and women where religious beliefs actually causes this sexual trauma, right? And that sexual trauma is not always something that happens directly to us, right? It's subtle, it's sinister, it's subconscious. And it's playing out in these ways where, especially as women, we pick up as it just being our identity. So like when I start working with a lot of my clients, some of them have these beliefs of like, I'm just not a sexual person, or I'm not a person who and maybe even has ever prioritized pleasure. And so there's these different beliefs that these religious ideologies store within us, especially as women, to downplay this area of our existence that is really there to catapult us in our lives and in every degree. So, I even was reading this in one of my books yesterday called Passionate Enlightenment, and it's about women in Tantric Buddhism. And you don't have to know about Buddhism to understand this, but in a Tantric perspective, like women were the holders of sexual teachings. And those sexual teachings were sought out from men and from other people to be taught to them for wisdom and for healing, right? And we've become disconnected from that over thousands of years, right? Those religious ideologies started to be put into monastic traditions or patriarchal traditions. And so women were taken out of the picture, especially when it came to pleasure and sexuality. And we see this mostly everywhere, mostly in every religion, except for very few, where women are at the forefront of using our bodies, pleasure and sexuality as ways to connect to the divine.
I love that you're talking about this before I ask this question, because that's exactly where my head went, where I was like, if everything you're saying is true, sexual, spiritual, emotional, sensual pleasure, not that it's not, right? But if it's true, then at our most naked time, which would be thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, it would make sense that at some point this was known.
Yeah.
So you're saying it was, and then just over the course of time, at some point, it started to turn or get erased and went away, predominantly for the woman.
Exactly. Yeah. And we all suffered as a result of that. Like men are suffering now more than ever too. This isn't just about women. This is about all of us. And by including sex into this beautiful evolutionary process that we're all a part of, we actually come into a state of union, a state of unity. And I believe that as long as we stay disconnected from this fundamental aspect of ourselves, which is sexuality, which is using pleasure as that medicine, then it's going to be very difficult for us to unionize moving into the future. So this is such a radical, like I always like to say that pleasure is a radical act. It's that radical act against the social norms of numbing out, of dissociating, of settling, of saying this is just is what it is.
I'm writing down settling and numbing out. I think that is so true.
Yeah.
This is like making me sort of sad a little bit. It really is, because it's like how many individuals, including myself, don't know this. And there's a whole realm of like pleasure that
is untapped or it's not mainstream. I mean, you have sacred sexuality and tantric this and that, but a lot of that, unfortunately it can be diluted. Let's just say that. When things become so mainstream, they can become diluted, right? And some women see that as like this fluffy, complex, woo-woo thing, right? And my belief is for us to come full circle and seeing that pleasure, sex, the intricacies of intimacy that we get to experience is right here, right now. And that there's a much more grounded approach through that, right? It's not this big fluffy thing. Sure, it can be complex, but it's also not. It's also very simple. And so there's different ways for us to access that. But the good news is that we're inherently wired for it.
Yeah. When you talk about pleasure and journaling, what does that mean? I think you talk about nervous systems and healing through journaling.
Yeah, so the pleasure journaling is a very simple practice that it takes us back into those 4 forms of pleasure. So this is where we can start asking ourselves, how have I met my needs for pleasure today? Because pleasure is not a want, it's a need. It's something that fuels our vitality and ability to actually get shit done. So that's one thing that we can start asking ourselves every single day. And the second piece of that, look at the needs that have been fulfilled and actually categorize them, like, and see them on paper. Okay, this need that I fulfilled for pleasure is in the sexual category, and this other one is in the emotional category. And this isn't to treat our pleasure as something to check off a list. That's kind of something that we will end up falling into sometimes. And I've also done this in the past when I first started this work. But it's for us to see, again, like on paper, seeing it clearly where we have fell into familiarity and comfort so that we feel safe in the body, right? And so when we move down this list of pleasures, it stretches our nervous system capacity a little bit more, very gently, right? Mm-hmm. This is meant to be a subtle process. Yeah.
How does somebody, so we're talking about pleasure, we're talking about how it's a need, right? We're not all married. We're not all in a relationship.
Yeah.
How does a woman or a man make sure that they're hitting those needs by themselves?
So one part of this is, right, pleasure is not just sex. So even if you don't have someone that you're with to engage in sexual activity, another part of this is actually prioritizing self-pleasure. A lot of women won't even think about self-pleasure unless they're with a partner and unless that partner is actually engaging them for sex, right? So this is how conditioned we've been. And self-pleasure has been something so pivotal in my own relationship, because then I get to take that into the bedroom and into my relationship as a whole, knowing what it is that I want, knowing that I am actually responsible for my pleasure instead of putting that onto somebody else and making them responsible for me feeling a certain way. And through that process, it's also a healing journey. So, like, self pleasure for me is not about getting off. Like, that's great if that happens. But self pleasure is actually this way for me to look at what's actually happening internally. Where are my emotions? Where do I have different things stored within my pelvis, within my sexual organs, right? That I can now release and let go of. So those are through particular different pleasure practices like orgasmic awareness that I teach some of my one-on-one clients. But just starting there is like, okay, where am I even prioritizing pleasure in the first place?
When I almost feel like this is something that should be first not figured out, first, I guess, tapped into by yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you're married.
1000%. Yeah. Yeah.
So the journaling could almost be like a first step towards having one-on-one conversations with yourself around sexual, spiritual, emotional, sensual pleasure.
Yes.
What it means for you before you start having conversations with an outside person.
1000%. And that also gives us the ability to look in and see what limiting beliefs we're holding on to, right? Because I like to, like, I usually say that sexual issues have non-sexual solutions. And it's always going to be wrapped up in our beliefs about ourselves, right? What are the stories we've created about our relationship to sex, pleasure, and intimacy? Most of us are afraid of intimacy without even realizing it. So when we're striving for that very thing that we desire most in the world, which is intimacy and connection with other human beings, it's going to be difficult for us to attract, right, that into our lives if that limiting belief is like, no, like you're afraid of the very thing that you want, right? So pleasure is a way for us to also show up in empowered vulnerability.
What does empowered vulnerability mean?
I like to use the term empowered vulnerability because we're showing up as the leader of our lives rather than showing up to someone in our vulnerability and then expecting them to fulfill that need, that desire. I'm not saying that can't happen, right? It's important for to allow other people to sometimes fulfill our needs and to support us. But empowered vulnerability is where we show up with a particular issue, problem, belief, determined to have an outcome either from another person or from ourselves. And if that other person is unwilling or they just don't have the capacity to support us in that moment, we're empowered enough to go and find a solution, right? And in a loving way. This isn't like, like this isn't meant to be this this very rigid thing. Empowered vulnerability actually creates more spaciousness and expansion within us.
I totally get that. So this feels good. So starting out just on your own, doing some journaling around those 4 prompts: sexual, spiritual, emotional, sensual, what that means for them personally, because everyone's different. Right. Before having a conversation with your partner, and then you can step into your empowered vulnerability because it's you. You're not having to worry, because I feel like what you're saying is so true as far as, like, you said something like, most people have issues around some sort of trauma around sex. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said something like most people have issues or challenges around sexuality.
One, I would like to change that to 100% of us have some conditioning around sex and intimacy, period. I've never had a woman or a man approach me with anything, right? Even in day-to-day conversations, it's because society has conditioned us to have those certain beliefs, right? We have things that have been stored from our mothers and their mothers and their mothers. Even if we haven't personally experienced sexual trauma, it's impacting this area of our lives. So 100% of us have something to do, some limiting belief, some trauma related to sex and intimacy.
I'm wanting to take this down this just like a crazy rabbit hole, but before we possibly do that, I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. Before we possibly do that, I want to ask, how is tapping into this helping us with our performance, our fulfillment, and our creativity? Like, how does this help us in our life?
So many ways. Well, again, when we tune into this area, maybe that we've been avoiding or haven't fully accessed, we can see the impacts that's going to have on our identity, right? And for most of us leading businesses or in leadership roles, identity is everything because it relates to our authenticity, our ability to trust the world around us, to trust ourselves, to trust other people, right? So a huge component of this is being able to walk in the world in a way where we have faith in ourselves and in humanity, right? And I know that seems like a grand thing, but I mean, it is, it's huge. So that's one piece. And again, sexual energy is vitality energy. And so especially as we age as women, and even when we're in our younger years, being able to cultivate a sexual charge is going to do wonders for our productivity, for how we feel, and how we actually walk in the world. Because if sexual energy is vital energy, it's actually affecting the way that we look, like our skin, our eyes, our posture, right? So it has a physical effect on our being, on our magnetism, how we show up, right? And there's like, I could list 1,000 things on why someone should tune into their sexual energy and form a better relationship to intimacy and sex. But I think one more huge component here is our ability to, again, form connections, right? Because most of us have a capacity or a limit to how far we can actually connect. And we feel that discomfort, right? So it's like that closing down, that shutting off, the weight we have on our shoulders, whether it be from shame or beliefs that we've had about ourselves, right? So we can see how that affects our ability to actually show up and let in abundance, let in the things that we desire, whether it's a relationship or more money or a different career, whatever that is. So a sexual energy, it starts here from everything. And there's something that I often say is that all healing is inherently sexual because it stems from sexual energy. It doesn't necessarily mean the act of sex, but the sexual energy itself. Yeah.
I get all of that. So I'm thinking of when I was probably like 19 years old, I was at church, dressed up, Jehovah's Witnesses dress up, like a dress. And there's this man that I used to talk to. I was 19. This man was probably like 45. I don't know. A little chubby man who was married with kids. And he was really smart, religiously, very smart. And I just appreciated his knowledge. And every single day, or every single time we went to church, which Jehovah's Witnesses go to church 3-4 times a week, I would find myself having conversations with him, non-sexual conversations, just conversations about God, religion, biblical, prophets. I don't know. I just like to pick his brain, right? One day, after maybe 20 total conversations with this man, my dad pulls me aside, like angrily, and he said something in Spanish. I'm Hispanic background. I didn't know what he said because I don't speak Spanish, but my parents speak Spanish. I knew he was mad. So I stopped talking to the guy. I was like, oh, sorry, well, I gotta go. Whatever. We leave. And my dad gave me this whole lecture in the car about how I was being flirty, too sexual. How do you think his wife feels? You're 19 years old. You're attractive. You're making his wife feel like shit. Whatever. Just like totally just. I never talked to the guy ever again. I never looked at him and I never talked to him ever again. It was super awkward because I went from like best friends, not really, but like best friends, to like never ever seeing or talking to him ever again. Anyways, I'm saying this because when I was in that realm between like 19 and maybe like 23, there was a constant conversation around me and how I held myself with sexual energy. Not only did my parents every once in a while say stuff, but like my friends, like the friend group, would say just weird things about the way that I would hold myself, the way that I spoke, the way that I acted. It wasn't like I was dressing like a hoochie mama, right? I was just dressed normal. But the way that I presented myself with like the confidence or the stature or the power, whatever it was, came off very sexual. And a lot of shame around that has over the years changed the way that I show up. And I think about that sometimes, like if this is all coming, that's why I kind of got emotional. Oof. Because I think about her like a lot. Not in a like, not in a bad way, but like in a why can't I have her back way? And the nervousness of like getting her back because of the way society could possibly view me because of what I was told back then. And as you're speaking, I'm just thinking of like, what would happen if we all stepped into this and why possibly it did turn. I don't know, like how does somebody show up with positive, confident, sexual power, but then not intimidate or create jealousy around counterparts?
Well, I think that the last part of that is we cannot be responsible for how other people feel and what their reactions or triggers are because we're showing up in our power, right? So yeah, like Christine just said in her comment, clearing shame from religious programming. So, part of this, and like I've worked through a lot of this myself. Like I grew up with a mother constantly telling me men only want one thing and one thing only. Basically, you have to protect yourself. And once you give that thing away, aka sex, your body, whatever, that you're going to be taken advantage of. So you better approach lightly, right? And then comes the additional warning of don't give it away too soon, meaning your virginity. I was pretty late, considerably of other younger women. I was considerably pretty late into like, quote unquote losing my virginity. But that being said, part of why I believe I've always been drawn to this work is because I started self-pleasuring and exploring my body at a very young age. And there was so much shame around that for me. I always had some knowing that there was something more to this. there was a freedom or liberation, or it's difficult to put into words, of that experience of being in my body, just me, being able to feel the sensations and the connection that I had with myself. And then somewhere along the way, we learned that that's wrong, dirty, shameful. And again, like you just mentioned, like it shows up in these most subtle ways. Like you just mentioned how it has created this little line for you, like through the years of, okay, I'm actually holding on to how other people feel, right? All because of that little girl standing in church, innocently having a conversation about God with a man at church, right? Non-sexual, completely innocent.
Absolutely. And I was so confused because as a witness, you're kind of naive. Like they kind of keep you in a bubble. So I didn't like know, I didn't like sit at the back of the bus and like know sex terms and like swear. And I sat like behind the school bus driver. I was a total nerd. Like, and then, came into my body or whatever it was, senior year into my 20s, right? So I'm 19 years old. I'm, I guess, looking pretty, but I'm so naive, I don't even know what I'm doing. And I was so confused by what my dad was saying. I was just like, what are we even talking about right now? Like, I'm literally doing nothing. And I felt so bad. And I felt bad for the wife too. Cause I was like, dude, I wasn't even trying. It didn't even occur to me that she might be jealous or upset or
And
whatever.
it's in our language too. Like when you said I was naive, you were not naive, you are innocent, because naivety, I believe that's the term, it requires us to know something about the thing and then we choose to ignore it, right? But you did not know. You didn't know what you didn't know.
Yeah.
So it was completely innocent.
Yeah.
Right. So then in comes this only information we've ever been given about sex, and that has to do with it being our fault that someone else had a conversation with us. It's our fault that we made somebody feel bad, right? So that's our first introduction usually into the world of sex, intimacy, and even just relating to other people, especially the opposite sex as women.
Yeah. Wow. This is so interesting to me. I don't want to say like I didn't know there was individuals that taught what you taught, but I can definitely say that this is something that so many of us need. Do you work predominantly with women or do you work with men and women?
I work with men and women, and predominantly women, I would say, but I love working with men as well. Just the work looks a little bit different, and I've usually worked with women and their male partners. So I prefer to work with women first, and then their partners will usually step in and want to also do that work as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. If you want to read this out loud, do you want to read it out loud? What Christine wrote?
Oh, they put chastity belts on us as teens and then never gave us the key. How can you be a sex goddess for your partner when you don't know how? Yeah, I mean, like she's saying, how can we show up in our relationships and evolve our sexual connection with our partners even when we don't know what we don't know? So, even going back into some of the experiences that I've had, like part of this process for me in developing my sexuality with a partner was actually completely spontaneous. It was this moment when I was in London dating someone at the time who lived in the UK, and we were in the midst of having sex, and all of a sudden there was this, I don't like to use the term awakening because it seems so fluffy. I didn't know what was happening, but all of a sudden there was this union that occurred, and I got transformed into a deep state of meditation, or I don't know what you call it. And there was this merging right, that occurred where I didn't know whose body was whose. I didn't know if I was male or female. I was just this present being enjoying bliss and pleasure. So that was this taste for me. At the time, I didn't know what that was. I just went on with my life, and nothing like extraordinary happened after that until I revisited, right? Like, how do I recreate that experience now consistently? Because it was something so profound that it stuck with me. And this isn't something, again, for us to like attain, right? But it just showed me what was possible in relationship to the pleasure and sex that I allowed myself to actually have.
Do you work with individuals who, thank you for sharing that story, by the way. Thank you. Do you work with individuals who are opposites in their sexuality? So like one person is very timid around it and the other one is wanting to explore more.
Absolutely. That's extremely common. I would
Yeah,
say
I feel
that,
like it. Yeah.
yeah, a big reason why women will show up in this work in the first place is because something's already happening in their relationship where there's a disconnect when it comes to sex or even libido, right? And obviously that affects both partners and creates a disconnect. So there's many reasons that could be occurring, but I would say that's one of the prime reasons why women seek out this work. And then we discover, like, we open a can of worms and there's just so much more to explore there than just libido, or I mean, that's a huge aspect, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know what your personal beliefs are, but that's one of the things that I never really understood with, and even when I was younger, with the religion that I grew up with, was like, what if you're not sexually compatible and then you're with this person and then you're married and then they don't believe in divorce? It always just seemed so much like a trap
Hmm.
to me. Because I do feel like that is so important that you're at least on similar levels, not the same, but like similar levels sexually, because it could cause a lot of stress on one way or the other. What you like, just not being emotionally capable, like what you're saying. It's not just about sex, right? But there's like a spiritual and emotional, sensual connection that needs to be going on. And if the person you're with is just not at all interested in experiencing or knowing or appreciating any of it, that's a huge freaking deal.
Yeah. I mean, that was the same thing that happened to me with that same experience that I just mentioned. Because after that experience, spontaneous experience I had, I was like, okay, like, I need to explore this more. Are you with me? And they were just like, absolutely not. I have zero interest. And that was
Yes.
really painful to hear. And so when I work with women, like, a big part of this, yeah, their partners may not be interested in actually exploring that. And so there's different ways to approach it. The first thing, again, is the tables and look in at ourselves at where we're actually asking for the thing that we're not going to get because we haven't embodied the very thing that we want, right?
God.
So that's part of it. And I've seen relationships transform when a woman starts prioritizing her pleasure. Because she becomes magnetic, she starts
I could see that.
becoming that law of assumption, right?
Yeah.
So even when we're talking about like like magnetizing energy, fire energy or sexual energy is magnetizing energy. So if we turn that on and start to actually embody it without being attached to a particular outcome, we actually become more magnetic to what it is that we desire.
Hmm.
So I've seen it turn around and flip tables. This just happened recently with a client of mine. For over 20 years in her marriage, her husband, zero interest in any type of self-growth, any type of personal healing, either for themselves in the relationship or for himself as an individual. And we've worked together now for less than 3 months. And now her husband has agreed to go into couples counseling as well as do his own personal work. And now she's also experiencing more pleasure because she's prioritizing it.
Yeah.
And asking for what it is that she wants and having the difficult conversations that put her in a place of vulnerability. But every single time she's done that, she's come out on the other side with like this just full exhale because she's finally done the thing that she hadn't done in 20 plus years, right? Like talking about sex. They've never done that. And the first time she approached her husband was to say, hey, I want to have sex with you. I'm actually turned on. I'm in my ovulation, but there's a disconnect. This is what I want. This is what I would like to receive from you. Right? So it creates an opening in the relationship. And sometimes, or all of the time, one person in the relationship has to be the one who steps in and says, okay, I'm going to shift. Are you coming with me?
Yeah. I totally understand what you're talking about. I don't have an experience with that, but I have an experience just in stepping into power, stepping into authenticity. And it almost is like none of it, they don't even matter anymore because you're so in tune with who you are. And then in turn, it actually gets them to like turn their head because they're recognizing the power that you're now holding.
Yeah, and it's not like a game. Like I used to think that this was like a game that had to be played, like if I play hard to get almost. And like that's not what we're going for. But yes, like it creates a ripple effect in the relationship where we are becoming more magnetic for our partners, and they do turn their heads and they're like, what's that about? I want a piece of that. Right. And it actually, that embodiment brings out their best selves. It brings out this desire within them to connect, because at the end of the day, we have to remember when there's conflict in a relationship, like we both have the same desire, and that is to reconnect, to rekindle, to form intimacy. Like that is a human desire, core desire that every human being has.
Mm.
So when we are tuning into our own pleasure and taking that on as our responsibility, it automatically lets the pressure off of our partners, and it helps them to actually show up in more love, compassion, and a desire for connection as a result.
Wow. Yeah, I can totally see that. This has been great. I feel like I could just keep talking for like another hour. So just so much information that I think, or that I know, or we both obviously know that it's just lacking so much, and it's not for, our own lack of wanting to know. It's just the lack of not knowing that we're supposed to know. Kind of like what you were saying earlier. You don't know what you don't know. So this is good stuff, girl. Good for you.
Thank you.
Good for you. Who should be reaching out to you? Who do you help? We have a ton of people watching live.
Like I said, I help men and women, especially women who are going through breakups, divorce, career changes, women who desire to finally prioritize their pleasure so they can show up in more leadership. Anything from sexual dysfunction to sexual desire, and everything in between. So women who want to prioritize themselves in a way that they haven't before and experience not just the best sex that they've ever had, but also how that gets to amplify every area of their lives. Those are the women who should be reaching out to me and at least booking a taster session to see if, what this work can actually do for them.
Beautiful. And then where can people find you on social media if they wanted to follow you?
It's my first and last name, Ava Pikul, ava.pikul. It's ava.pikul.
Awesome. And then your website, diamondascension.org, for anyone that wants to check out. It is in a clickable link in the description wherever you're watching us at, so you can scroll down and check that out too. This has been great. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much information. I took a ton of notes.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you to those of you that are still here watching live all the way to the very end. We appreciate you. If you're watching on the replay, like I said, make sure you hashtag replay wherever you're at so we can send you some love in the comments. Follow, like, share. Any closing thoughts, Ava, as we wrap up?
I think that there's just a message that wants to come through about being a woman who has done it all and has carried the world on her shoulders, that it's obvious many of us walk through the world with a guard up around our hearts. And that we have to be brave and courageous enough to let down that guard little by little or boulder by boulder and actually step into the life we want to live without settling. And if we don't know what it is that we really desire, it's because we have created that guard up along our hearts. And the antidote to that is creating the intimacy in your life and the pleasure within to understand our internal world and finally get what we really want and not have the shame and guilt around it. So I just encourage women to notice where they've been settling, where they've put a guard up, especially when it comes to human contact in our day-to-day, especially with other women. And to notice that this all stems from our ability to connect to our fucking pelvis and our hearts. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. This is Her Talk Show. My name is Sabrina Victoria. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, Ava, and inspiring us all. For those of you listening live or on the replay, I run a community called Her Nation Global. We have conversations just like this with amazing women every single day. We would love for you to join us. Our Facebook group is also in a link in the description below. So feel free to click on that and join us. Until next